Anyways, today I'd like to talk to you about the Chanel Miller Reflective Garden. So before I begin, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the events that occurred that led up to the creation of this garden. So in January of 2015, Chanel Miller was raped behind the dumpster of KA after a party by Brock Turner, who was a freshman on the swim team at the time. And about a year later, he was taken to trial and convicted of 3 charges of sexual assault and only sentenced to 6 months of jail. And there was widespread outrage at the lack of severity of his sentencing, and later on the judge was actually recalled. But this was considered completely outrageous at the time, and still is. A year later, as part of a settlement and sort of a conciliatory gesture with Chanel Miller, Stanford completed the construction of a reflective garden that was basically supposed to memorialize the events that occurred and establish a healing process for victims of sexual assault here at Stanford. And finally, in 2019, just recently, Chanel Miller had actually previously been known as Jane Doe up until this point, and she released a memoir called Know My Name, where she actually finally came out as Chanel Miller, and this was sort of viewed as her victory over the silencing of Brock Turner and Stanford University. But these slides don't really tell the full story of what occurred, because in between her sexual assault and the completion of the reflective garden, a lot of outrageous things really happened. So Stanford reached out to her and said, we'd like you to provide a quote that we will put on a plaque and put in this garden to memorialize you. So Chanel Miller provided a quote that was extremely explicit and direct and essentially identified Brock Turner, not by name, but by almost every other aspect of him. And this was immediately rejected by the university. So the university said, okay, give us another quote. And she provided the following quote. "You took away my worth, my privacy, my energy, my time, my safety, my intimacy, my confidence, my own voice until today." And the university actually rejected this quote as well. And so, after the rejection of 2 quotes suggested by Chanel Miller, there was basically a community uproar at Stanford. They had this completed garden that had no quote whatsoever, and so there was a petition that was circulated among Stanford students that received over 2,500 signatures that basically said, Stanford, you need to honor your obligation to Chanel Miller and place a plaque of one of these 2 quotes at the garden, otherwise you're failing the student body. The ASSU senators wrote an open letter to Persis Drell, also condemning her and her lack of action over the issue, and there was sort of a general feeling of widespread outrage, which you can see in Stanford Daily articles at the time, and even Stanford Daily articles from a week ago, just given that the plaque was just installed yesterday. So basically, at this point, we're left with a garden that nobody likes, and the university is completely silent. And so as members of the student body, we're left asking ourselves, how does the Chanel Miller Memorial fail in its mission, and more importantly, how can Stanford fix the garden and prevent such misjudgments from occurring in the future? And the answer is my thesis, which is the memorial whitewashes history in an attempt to preserve Stanford's reputation as an educational institution that doesn't have to deal with important and complex social issues like sexual assault. So the first way in which it whitewashes history and fails in its purposes is by failing to establish a healing process for victims of sexual assault, which is one of the memorial's stated purposes. And the first way it fails in establishing a healing process is through its plaque, which was actually coincidentally installed initially by a student who was correcting the lack of action by the university. So first of all, this plaque is extremely tiny. I actually had to zoom it up to the full size of the screen so that you could even read it. So essentially, you could walk into this garden and have no idea that it's a memorial to sexual assault or to Chanel Miller. And something that's sort of particular, drawing from trauma theory, something that's particular to victims of sexual assault and the sexual assault experience in general is that the establishment of victimhood is extremely important to the healing process. So many survivors of sexual assault actually have trouble sort of establishing themselves as the victim, and oftentimes they have conflicting emotions about, such as, maybe I drank too much and put myself in a position where I was taken advantage of, maybe it's somehow my fault or something like that. And this is very harmful to the healing process. So one of the most important and initial steps to the entire healing process for victims of sexual assault is societal recognition that they are a victim. And the tiny size of this plaque basically does nothing to ensure that. And more than that, I will acknowledge the quote itself does begin to establish victimhood in its use of possessives like my time, my safety, my intimacy. So it begins, it's like a step in the right direction, but the vagueness of the quote and Stanford's rejection of the first initial explicit quote basically negates that, because there's no mention of sexual assault, there's no mention of the actual crimes that occurred. So it's basically the equivalent of if you went to the 9/11 memorial in downtown New York and there was literally no mention of 9/11. The second way in which it fails to establish a healing process is the angle of the two benches that are in the patio. And so ultimately sexual assault is one of the defining features of it is that it's sort of a crime of isolation, and victims frequently feel like they are isolated and have gone through this experience that alienates them from society and alienates them from their personal relationships. And so rhetorically, the 90-degree angle of these two benches sort of communicates to people in the memorial that the healing and reflective process is something that is undergone alone and in a sort of contemplative context and not within groups. So somebody sitting right here is basically never going to interact with somebody sitting right here. So there's no way that this monument can be experienced in a group setting or a way that actually fosters a group healing process. And it tells people that when they enter this garden, they should basically sit alone on one of these benches and just think, and that basically fails to establish a healing process. The other way that this memorial fails to accomplish its purpose is essentially that it is so nondescript that there's a complete sense of placelessness. It has no feeling of a serious memorial or a place where healing should occur, and therefore it prevents the events that occurred from entering public memory, and also from preventing sexual assault on campus in the future. And so the first way it does that is its landscaping. You can see there's literally 2 trees. It's completely non-isolated. It's sitting next to a basketball court. I've been to this memorial when there are people playing basketball, and it's just not very conducive to being a serious place of consideration and memorialization. And moreover, this fountain is a big failure. So the way that this fountain fails is it's completely non-monumental and non-solid, and it could literally be a fountain anywhere on this campus. And if you look at the readings by Edward Casey that we looked at the beginning of the year, one of the things that he talks about that lends itself to public memory is sort of solid features of monuments that ensure the futurity of the event, and sort of an association of when you look at this fountain, you should immediately associate it with events that occurred. And that's sort of what allows memorials to basically ensure that events enter the public memory. And this fountain is literally so small and undistinguished and unrelated to the sexual assault of Chanel Miller that it doesn't allow the events to enter public memory. And also, because it can't enter public memory, it also does nothing to prevent sexual assault in the future. Because the way that we prevent sexual assault in the future is by sort of creating something that really resonates with people that go there, and people should feel a sense of outrage. They should feel upset when they go to this memorial, and they should say, it's necessary that I do something personally to help stop sexual assault in the future. And the lack of public memory and the lack of sort of scandalizing the people who visit this means that it's a complete failure in being a political weapon to stop sexual assault in the future. So finally, how did this happen? Undemocratic processes and conflicting interests on the part of Stanford, and these are sort of revealed by an open letter by Persis Drell to the student body, where she says, "We consulted with sexual violence counselors and others," and it's completely non-transparent. She doesn't explain anything about the process, so it didn't involve the public at all. And then you can see the conflicting interests in her letter. She basically says, "I'd like to correct any misinterpretations about this memorial," and goes on attack for 3 paragraphs, and there's no sense of like, wow, maybe we screwed up, or maybe there's a reason why 2,500 people are upset at us. And there's really just no sense of apology or anything, and you can see how Stanford doesn't really want to address this because it's not in their best interests. And how can we prevent it from happening in the future? Here's an example of a monument or an adjustment of monuments that was done democratically. So here in Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, a democratically elected commission was created to determine the fate of very controversial Confederate monuments. And there were public hearings and public surveys and literally public votes in the courthouse where people could speak. You can see all these people. Like the public actually had a voice in the process, and it was documented that the public had a voice. And the final result may not have been satisfactory to everyone, but at least it was democratic and involved the voices of everyone. Same thing happened in New York City, where they considered removing the Christopher Columbus statue. Another democratically elected commission was created to determine the fate of it. And finally, why do we care about this? Because it addresses a point of pain and shame on campus that we experience every day. It actively prevents sexual assault survivors on campus from healing. It does absolutely nothing to help prevent sexual assault in the future. And also, more than all of these things, and just previously unmentioned, is that this failure of a monument also is just an ethical failure on the part of Stanford that deserves to be rectified, and it just represents a lack of actual justice to Chanel Miller. And so I believe that there's an ethical obligation by the university to fix this monument. Thank you.